can I be obedient even when it's hard? Can I be obedient even when it feels like my life was just taken from me, right? Or my joy was just taken from me. Can I still be obedient and push through and do the work of the Lord, right? And to continue to do his message. And I think even when like life it feels like it's falling apart around you in so many ways.
Yeah.
I think there is some encouragement to just, like you said, get up and the next day and just obey and just do,
be obedient.
even when it's hard. Yo, welcome back to the Vibes Daily Podcast. It is day 253 of our year-long series we have titled Devoted, where we are journeying through the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation. We are so glad that you're with us. If you have joined us here in the book of Ezekiel, and I am back again, joined by my wife, Victoria, as we kind of continue through Ezekiel. We're at 20 chapters last week. We'll pick up here on chapter 21 today. But just before we do that, as we do kind of each week, love the opportunity just to ask a question, get our thoughts going. And one I thought would be interesting that I was actually going to say for New Testament when we got there, but I think it's actually really relevant because Ezekiel actually teaches in a lot in parables, even like the question you asked kind of in the last week, right? That even he was like, hey, they don't think all I do is talk in parables. So just want to open, do you have a favorite parable in scripture and why?
You know what? Reading through this time, the Bible, I actually didn't realize how many parables Ezekiel had. It just stuck out to me this time around. But so my parable of choice, those in the New Testament, where I remember most of them coming from Jesus, and he did teach about one where like the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure in the field, and the man who stumbles upon it, he like buries it back up. He goes and he sells all his possessions just so that he can buy this field because this treasure is worth everything that he had before. And that just really spoke to me because it was like finding God and finding this kingdom of heaven is so much worth more than anything that I own. And I should be willing to give everything and anything away just to receive the gift of God and Jesus Christ and salvation. So, that's the one that stuck out to me.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, I think for me, it's probably the parable of the sheep and the goat.
Okay.
I think it's Matthew 25, where essentially the kingdom of God and at the end times, God is going to separate the righteous from the unrighteous, essentially. And I think what I appreciate about it is not all the parables are so like clear exactly what Jesus means sometimes. They can be a little hard to interpret. Like even if we just think back to these parables of these two eagles last week, that wasn't necessarily straightforward. And so, but he makes it very clear what it means to be like righteous, right? And it's to do for the least of these. It's to, feed the hungry and clothe the naked and visit the sick and the imprisoned. And, it's those things, right? And I just love it. I just love how simple it is that like, to me, it speaks to so much of like what we miss and misunderstand of God and his heart, which is that like, it's not so much about, whether we go to church and whether we, do some of those things. Like those things are important, but that's not ultimately what grants us, the kingdom of heaven. It's to love others and to do those things. So I don't know. I just love that parable because I feel like it's just so simple and direct and gives me instructions. I like the stuff that's like real clear instructions. Like that makes my life so much easy that like at least I can like pursue those things and pursue them with my whole heart. And I feel like that gives me a great chance to be with the Lord. So but okay. Well, let's just jump into Ezekiel. We will get one parable in today's reading, but or at least one. But we'll start with chapter 21, where we kind of get God's judgment, really again about this sword. This sword here comes back again. We saw it before in last week's reading that, he keeps talking about this sword, this sword, this sword. But yeah, what jumped out to you here in 21 as, God's judgment is professed?
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about he's about to take this sword from its sheath, okay, and cut off both the righteous and the wicked, right? It's so interesting to me that like he then calls Ezekiel not just to face the sanctuaries of Jerusalem, right, and preach against them and prophesy against the land of Israel, but he tells them to start weeping and groaning, right? Like right before their eyes, like groan with a broken heart. This is verse 6.
Yeah.
And they're going to ask why you groaning. You say, because the news is coming. Like every heart will melt, every hand will be weak, every spirit will be discouraged, and all knees will red with urine. Here he goes with these knees and urine again. But yeah, that like this judgment of the Lord is coming, and that he knows this sword is coming against the people. Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. You? Well, yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, it was definitely the wailing, right? Like even in verse 12, just like cry out and wail, son of man, for it's against my people, it's against all the princes of Israel. They are given over to strike your thigh in grief. But I think like the thing that really actually stuck out to me first was just going back to really verse 2, because you said it was against the sanctuaries and against the land of Israel. And I don't know, like the sanctuaries piece kind of really threw me off, because like I think I read that and interpreted it more as just like some of like the idols that people may have been building up more so than like the sanctuary itself or the temple, right?
Yeah.
At first. And so again, now it is facing Jerusalem, so that is where the temple is. But I was curious if like, because there's this plural to it, right, and it's against the sanctuaries, right? Like that he's preaching against, that there was this part of me that it was like they built up these sanctuaries to these idols or whatever the case may be, that he was specifically preaching against. So that part I just thought was really interesting as well. But I don't know, jumping down to 14, like he has this where he kind of gives him this instructions to like clap his hands together that I thought was interesting.
Yeah. And
it's just almost like again, just another, I don't say illustration, but just demonstration, right? That like the number of times, I'm assuming is the number of times that he's clapping is also that 2 or 3, times that the sword will strike, right? But yeah, I thought that was just an interesting thing. And then even specifically that God saying he also will clap his hands together kind of to satisfy his wrath. But I don't know. What else jumped out to you? Anything else in 21?
Yeah, and then he's just like marking this road with his sword, right? And he's just like, one fork of the road, he's going to practice divination to figure out what side to go on, right? So he shakes the arrows and consults the idols. This is verse 21, and observes the liver, and then the answer is going to be Jerusalem. Like he's like telling you, this is what the King Babylon is going to do. He's going to think that he's going to get this answer from his divination and stuff, right? I already know what's going to happen. It's going to land on Jerusalem, right? In his right hand, indicating that he should set up battering rams and give orders to slaughter and raise the battle cry against them, right? But I think it's really interesting. So like that God's in control of all this, right? That like he's like this is what the Lord's going to do, and this is going to happen because he's like I've drawn attention to your guilt, your iniquity, all the things, and I'm going to be using him to like my judging, bring punishment to you. And so I think it's just interesting that he is saying what this Babylon king is going to be doing in terms of practicing divination and how it's going to be Jerusalem. And that's going to be ultimately the reason why he sets up his siege against them. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say to that same point, just there in verse 33, I thought 23, that just thought it was interesting that to those who have sworn an oath to Babylon, that it's going to seem like false divination, right? Like, I don't know. I just feel like it's really interesting this idea that, because prophecy and false prophecy is such a consistent topic through these books, right? That we've been in these prophetic books, and it's something that even is covered in the New Testament pretty extensively by like a Paul specifically, but even like John and James and Peter. But like, it's interesting that the prophecies, like the false prophecies, are often believed by the people, but the true prophecies are often like seen as, in this case, right, seen as like divination, right? Like, it's just interesting how easy it is to miss like the true prophecy of the Lord, and to kind of see it that way. And so like, one of the things this entire time we've been in these prophets that I've just really been challenged by is like, again, just making sure that we don't miss the word of God and miss his prophecy and his interpret his word, like the things that he says. And so like, it really has me like I said, just vigilant to like listen and to hear, because like, again, I don't want to be following a word that is technically false, right?
Yeah.
But I also don't want to be, missing the word that is true, right? Like, or one way or the other. And so I don't know, it's just seeing that like those that were devoted, because and the last thing on that is, it seems like the reason they missed it is because of where their devotion was, right? Like, it's because the things that mattered to them and the things that they were committed to and the things that like they were aligned with, and their alliances were like, because they were there, they missed what was true, know? So I think that it does give us some even insight into how we can avoid falling into that trap, which is simply by making sure our devotion is to the Lord, right? Rather than to other things. But yeah. Anything else here in 21 for you? Okay. Well, just before we kind of move all the way to 22, it does also kind of give a prophecy against the Ammonites, specifically, and not just Jerusalem and those sanctuaries as it kind of started. So the Ammonites get some too. And
at the end, it says, "You will not be remembered," in verse 32.
Yep.
That stuck out.
Yep. Again, we've talked about before how some of them got options to be restored, and others did not. So, the Ammonites won't be remembered. They're not getting a chance. But that takes us to 22. And in this point, again, it's about Israel's sin specifically. I thought this one was interesting because, again, it feels like it's targeted towards Israel and their sins, particularly the sins of like their leaders, their princes, whatever the case may be. What jumped out to you here in the beginning of 22?
Yeah, I think we mentioned it last week that it was about mentioning of the Sabbath being profaned again. And so in this list, this chapter, starting at verses 6 and 7, this is like father and mother are treated with contempt, right? Resident alien is exploited within you. The fatherless and widows are oppressed in you. You despise my holy things and profane my Sabbaths. And goes on to do more, but like I agree, because he continues to lay out exactly what they're doing, right? It goes on and on. But then he's like, you know what? I'm going to clap my hands against these different things, against these dishonest prophets, against this bloodshed. And he said, I'm going to purge you, verse 15. I will purge your uncleanness. And it is kind of like reminding me of how when he told them about living in this promised land, that like, do not come in here and defile the land. Yeah. Right? Like, as these other nations have come in and defiled it with all these different things that they were doing. And now they are doing the same and worse, as we'll see him even tell them, and worse. And he's just like, I'm going to have to purge you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things in this, I won't get too deep into this because one, we got a lot to talk to, and maybe not the best environment for this conversation, but in general, like even going back to, as you said, those chapters we read last week, and I'm assuming that was 18, I think that was. I will say one of the things that was interesting, in addition to the Sabbath, right, is it feels like so much of what was considered like unclean and sinful was like sexual, right? Like what I just thought was so interesting, that like there seemed to be so many Let me focus. Now again, it were things like specifically like with your neighbor's wife and like your daughter or your father-in-law or whatever the case may be. Like it was those kind of things specifically that were really, considered depravity. But I don't know why I just feel like that's so interesting that in this particular section, because again, if you had asked me, a lot of the things that I feel like God has tended to focus on when it came to what was sinful was, again, not taking care of the poor, right? And the widows, and making sure that you treat your neighbors right and do those kind of things. He also deals with, like, of course, not accepting bribes, that stuff. So
some stuff is here too.
So it was just interesting that like this Ezekiel tends to kind of point this out, where I feel like in the other passages it's not as, or the other prophets, those particular acts aren't as mentioned. And so I don't know if it's just specific to like the people in the time in which they were talking, right? If these are the certain acts that they were doing more so than others, right? Just like when they deal with like sacrificing of children or whatever, like those were acts that people were doing in that time.
Yeah.
So again, it just felt like it was interesting to call out, because it seems like God is specific to, like, when he professes his judgment, he's professing it to the people at that time and kind of what they were actually doing versus like some blanket, sinful statement. But
exactly.
But yeah, so it kind of continues in 17, and he just talks about, like, in a lot of ways, man, again, another illustration here, another just imagery, how Jerusalem really has just kind of become dross, which was a word I did not know prior to reading Ezekiel, but it's kind of reference to like the scum or like leftover part of metal, right? Specifically, like once it's like refined, you kind of scrape away some of the extra stuff. Anything jump out to you kind of in those few verses as it deals with that image?
Yeah, honestly, I was thinking Daniel. All of a sudden, I'm like, we talking about fiery furnaces? I have never heard of a fiery furnace really like that, except for in Daniel. So when I saw one here, I was like, oh, wow, this was a thing. But anyways, of course, it was how they did their metals, right? And molded them and shaped them. But yeah, he says in verse 21, yes, I will gather you together and blow on you with the fire of my fury, and you'll be melted within the city. As silver is melting inside a furnace, so you'll be melting inside the city. Then you'll know that I am the Lord, have poured out my wrath on you. And so, yeah, I thought that was really interesting, because I was like, he is not leaving any imagery behind here. Okay, you're not letting anything slide. He's like, what you need to keep your entertainment?
Yeah,
I got all the entertainment for you.
Yeah.
So this furnace was just another one, just how his destruction was going to come about. Yeah.
Okay, that's good though. Yeah, we've talked a little bit about his intentionality of kind of giving us these visual, addressing these visual learners, but like you said, just continues to double down on that. We're starting at 23, verse 23, not quite to chapter 23 yet, but just as it takes us to the end of this chapter.
Yes.
Anything that was specifically interesting to you as kind of deals with the sinful lands?
Yeah, once again, like he said he was going to purge them in this previous chapter, or in this chapter earlier. And then now he's saying that you are a land that has not been cleansed, right? In verse 24, that has not received rain in the day of the indignation. And so then he starts talking about the prophets, right? They're like roaring lions tearing its prey for the sake of riches and valuables.
Yep.
And then the priests who are violating his book of the law, right, in his instruction, who's profaning his holy things, not making a distinction between holy and common, and they're not even talking about clean and unclean anymore, right? They close their eyes to the Sabbath, your Sabbath again, right? And he's talking about what the officials, like he's going from rank to rank, right? And the officials here, like, and they're like wolves, and it's kind of like he's just like, every piece of your leadership is just out of order. Like, no, from the top to the bottom, like no one's doing right here. And so what grieved me is when I got to verse 30. When I got to verse 30, he says, I searched for a man among them who would repair the wall and stand in the gap before me on behalf of the land, so that I might not destroy it. But I found no one.
Yeah.
And that one was hard for me.
Yeah.
That was hard. So he's just like, I've brought their conduct down on their own heads.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder, honestly, like how Ezekiel feels to hear that.
Exactly.
Like, there's a part of me that goes like,
I mean, you got me, Lord.
Like, what about me, God? Like,
Daniel was like, you got me, Lord. Maybe because they already exiled.
Yeah. There's a part of me just like, I could do it, Lord. No.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm sure, he understood the intention of heart behind that phrase. But yeah, that grieves me, and again, I pray the Lord never looks upon this earth and kind of says the same thing, right? Or my church or my nation or my city, right? Like, that he doesn't just say there's no one to kind of stand in that gap. And so, yeah, I think that is a tough one for sure. But just to kind of keep moving, we get to 23 and we get these two immoral sisters. It's this picture of kind of what happened with Israel as well as with Judah. And very interesting, very interesting illustration here.
Yes.
Just kind of talking a little bit about where they ultimately, who they went to, like lusted after and some other things and whatnot. Talk to me a little bit about 23. I know it's kind of long, so you can kind of take it as a whole. Just kind of the story as a whole. What jumped out to you?
Yeah, so one sister, the first one he goes in on is Ohala, and she represents Samaria, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Ahalibah, I'm not saying these correctly probably at all.
It's all right.
And she represents Jerusalem, right?
The capital cities of Israel and Judah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it was this sentiment of like, you watched your first sister go and lust over the Assyrians, right? And go and do stuff and watch the Assyrians and then Egypt and all that, right? You watched. And I think when he gets to Jerusalem, he's like, you saw this in verse 11. Now her sister Ahalibah saw this, but she was even more depraved in her lust than Aholah, and made her promiscuous acts worse than those of her sister. Yeah. And it's like, you saw what was happening. You could have told your sister this was not right. And if anything, even if you didn't say that, you could have at least not done the same thing she did.
Exactly.
You could have watched, you could have shaken your head, and you could have turned and followed the Lord.
Yeah.
But you did even worse. It's kind of like you said, like, you go out and your friend is cutting up and you decide like, oh, we just doing this, or we finna do this all the way. And you just like cutting up out of control now. Yeah. Like, oh, like I got the permission to cut up. I'm gonna do more than anybody, right? And so I think it was interesting to me that was the big grief of his heart, was like, you watched this happen, you looked at it, and not only did you approve or condone it, like you went and did even worse.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, it's deep and I mean just so relatable in so many ways. And so like, yeah, obviously from the historical aspect, like that is exactly what happened, right? Assyria came in and took Israel away, and Judah was good for a little bit, right? Because Hezekiah at that time was the one that kind of spared them, but it was right after Hezekiah that it just went downhill again, right? So like, yeah, I do think it's what it says to me in some ways. I feel like there's a element that God feels like, someone used to say, if you know better, you should do better, right? Like, and that you're almost held to a higher standard because you have seen kind of what came before you, right? In some ways. But yeah, it like I said, it's very relatable. I feel like it was just like that as kids, man. Like, yes. I feel like our kids do this in some ways, absolutely. Right? Like, as soon as one of them does something,
they get that little side smirk, like, oh, they got away with that.
Right, they all get the idea.
I'm gonna do it too.
Yeah, and I'd be almost more mad at the second child because I'm just like, you knew better. You knew when they did it, it was wrong. You know what I'm saying? So why are you gonna come over here and act like you supposed to be? You can do that now, like, yeah. But on a more practical tip, like I said, it does say to me, man, I gotta watch. I gotta learn from others. man, that came before me, right? That have walked through this life. And I think this is why it's so important to have mentors and shepherds and people that are above you, because like they've been through those things before. They've walked through those things, right? Like, you know, even as like a pastor, like I have to take the time to be up under someone who's walked through pastoring, right? Who's made some mistakes, who maybe have lost some people, you know, that have left their church and, you know, have learned from those things, or have dealt with, you know, sin in their church, or they've dealt with like whatever the case may be. Like, I gotta have those people to go to, because it's like, okay, I don't want to make the same mistakes, right? And if you felt like you learned something from this, right? Or I watch you go through this and I witness it, then it's on me now to actually live up to that, right? And to do better. And so, I think like, again, obviously not just for those sisters, but I think or for those two nations, I think it is very applicable that we see a lot of examples of people who go before us and make mistakes. And those mistakes are supposed to be opportunities for us to learn, right? And to be better in the long run. But I know we kind of stuck at this first half of 23. Was anything else kind of in the second part, or just the rest of this chapter that stuck out to you?
Yeah, it was a pretty decently long chapter. But this verse 31, it says, "You have followed the path of your sister, so I will put her cup in your hand." I think that stuck out to you because, just like you were saying, like, you should learn from her. And he's like, since you didn't, right? Since you didn't, what she was gonna get, I'm gonna give it to you. Like, what I was gonna bring against her, I'm bringing against you, right? And you will drink it, and it will drain it, and then you will gnaw its broken pieces and tear your breast. For I've spoken. This is verse 34. But yeah, like it's because and the Lord said something earlier in this chapter about His jealousy, right? Verse 25, when I vent my jealous rage on you. And that's all this really is, right? That like, I am jealous you are continuously going to these other nations, and you have left me behind. So yeah, I think that's, so it says on 35, that reminded me, because in 35, he says, "Therefore, this is what the Lord God says, because you have forgotten me and cast me behind your back, you must bear the consequences of your indecency and promiscuity." And I think that's to me the gist of what I see here. It's just like, it's because the Lord's grieving you because He's lost you, and you're not even a little bit remorseful. Yeah,
that's good. I was say, I think one of the other things that just jumped out to me was back in 28, which is that, like, the Lord says, I'm going to hand them over to those you hate, or hand you over to those you hate, and to those you turned away from in disgust. And I don't know, I just think it was interesting that, like, their punishment was essentially to be ruled or led by, or I guess ruled is probably the better word, by those whom they ultimately despised, right? Like, I don't know, it's just such a funny punishment to me, but like, it's real that He's just like, all right, you know, you wanted to go after and chase after these other things, and push these people to the side, or hate them, whatever, but like, okay, cool, I'm gonna show you they're gonna actually overtake you in this process. But
yes.
Oh, that was interesting. Okay. Well, anything else in 23?
Nope, we can move.
All right, so 24, we have like two stories to kind of cut through really quick here.
Another parable.
Another parable. This parable of the boiling pot. Before we get to 15, which will end today, or verse 15. So, what did this parable show to you that you thought was interesting? Why do you think God used? Well, I'm gonna tell you why you think God used the pot, but like, I don't know if you know the answer to that. But what stuck out to you here about 24?
I didn't really have much I took away from it, honestly. But I was just watching this story as it was unfolding, and I mean, he's saying at the end, I'm not going to show pity, but like, I'm just going to put everything in the pot, boil it up, and woe to you, city, because you're going to be just like that. Yeah. What are your thoughts? Sorry, I didn't have anything deep and profound here.
No, and it, not necessarily. Again, it's another. To me, it's just kind of like, it's here, right? That was one of the things that just jumped out to me, that just starting in verse 2, that like right down today's day, this very day, the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem to this very day.
Yeah.
And, you know, obviously a lot of what we got was kind of before. So I did think that was interesting. But I also thought it was interesting that, like, if I look at verses, probably 11, I'll start at, where it says, set the empty pot on its coals so that it becomes hot and its copper glows, then its impurity will melt inside it. Its corrosion will be consumed. It has frustrated every effort. Its thick corrosion will not come off into the fire with its corrosion because of the depravity of your uncleanliness. Since I have tried to purify you, you would not, but you would not be purified from your uncleanness. So, like, I don't know. I just thought it was really interesting because, to me, this idea of like this water in this pot, or this, you know, not just water, but just like this boiling pot, and whether it's the metals that are in here, right, or the copper, that kind of stuff, that like ultimately this heat tends to purify things.
Yeah.
Right? Like he uses it. And I think it was an image more so of just like less than destruction. It was more like a refining and a purifying.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like that was kind of one of my takeaways, that it was like, I am doing this and it's going to hurt. Don't get it twisted. It's going to be painful. But I'm using this to ultimately purify you and refine you because, again, I plan to restore you, right? Like I plan to restore you, but I'm going to restore you like in a new way, in a clean way, and kind of start you over. So, I don't know. I just thought it was interesting that he used that specific imagery because it gave me that picture that it's not just like the burning of something, like, you know, lighting a fire to it, but instead it's more like a purification and a cleansing. So yeah, just really, again, as much as that's the case, you know, we like to joke in church. We always go to Refiner as one of our worship songs, and we like, Lord, we don't want that. I don't want to be tried by fire and purified. Like that's not something I want, because it hurts. That hurts and it's painful. But that jumps out to me. But chapter 24 ends with a very interesting passage. Very sad for Ezekiel. Yeah.
My goodness.
Very sad for Ezekiel because unfortunately his wife has to pass away and dies. And worse yet, he doesn't even get to grieve and mourn and cry.
I mean, and the fact that her death has to be a sign, right? Like, couldn't it just be like she done lived a good old age? I don't even know how old they are, but like, couldn't she just live a good old age and she just died? But now she's also dying as a sign for the Lord, which we should all be like, I'm honored, Lord, that you would do. But
yeah, that's not the thought I had.
Not at all.
But like, yeah, I mean,
I'm saying you want to be used by the Lord, but not like this, Lord.
Yeah.
That's what the complete thought of mine is.
Yeah.
So yeah, he said like take the delight of your eyes. I mean, he loves her.
Yeah, I think this has to be, of all the things. Like, look, first of all, I didn't even know Ezekiel was married until we got to this passage, right? Like, it didn't even jump out to me that he even had a wife until we got to 24. But secondly, like, it did shock me that, like I said, this is the hardest thing I feel like I would be called to do in all this passage, is to like, it's not even so much that her death was a sign. It was the fact that I don't get to grieve. And I don't get to mourn, and I have to like play it tough. Essentially is the way I kind of do it, right? And hold it in. And that is also part of the sign. You know?
Yeah.
But like, I think I wonder, even if some of what we learned from this is that, again, just everything happens for a reason, right? And that everything can teach us something about God.
Yeah.
You know? And so I think that's definitely something that I took away from this particular passage. But was there anything else kind of from the end of 24 that stuck out to you?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, so much integrity here. Like in 18, I spoke to the people in the morning and my wife died in the evening. The next morning, I did just as I was commanded.
Yeah.
And the people asked me, why won't you tell us what these things you're doing means for us? Like the next morning, he still got up and got it together just like the Lord asked him to. That's deep.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough, man. And like you said, just to know that all of us was just a sign for them to see that God is ultimately going to take the pride and joy from them too, right?
Yeah.
Like from the people in the same way. And so, but yeah, definitely got to respect that. Like you said, the integrity, the obedience, that willingness to step in and do what God has asked them to do, even in some of the most difficult seasons.
Yeah.
Right. To kind of press forward. And I do think there is some, not just encouragement, but just some challenge in that, right? That like, can I be obedient even when it's hard? Can I be obedient even when it feels like my life was just taken from me, right? Or my joy was just taken from me. You know, can I still be obedient and push through and do the work of the Lord, right? And to continue to do his message. And I think, you know, there's probably a lot of preachers out there that kind of experience this, like just trying to get up and lead or preach after tragedy in life, right? Or things of that nature, or, you know, continue to record podcasts or whatever the case may be, right? Even when like life is, it feels like it's falling apart around you in so many ways.
Yeah.
I think there is some encouragement to just, like you said, get up and the next day and just obey and just do, even when it's hard. So yeah, it's a good place for us to end for today. Again, we will pick up here at chapter 25 tomorrow. But appreciate you guys joining us again for the Vibes Daily podcast. Be with us the rest of this week as we continue through Ezekiel. Won't finish all of Ezekiel this week. We have a couple chapters we'll get through next week, but we will get through a majority of it by the end of this week. So thank you for joining us. Let's tune in next time. Until then, take care.
Thank you for joining us for the Vibes Daily podcast. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or download our favorite, the Vibes Church app. Visit vibes.church/devoted for additional episodes, notes, details, and the latest merch. Join us next time as we continue our journey through the Bible. Take good care.